an opportunity for us to really apply the African-centered approach that we use, because African people have always used images to speak, whether it be meta-nature or hieroglyphics from ancient Egypt, which I introduced my students to, or whether it be Adinkra symbols in West Africa that they were also introduced to. They got to really understand how symbols are very important to African life and history. So we discussed that first, and then I showed them some images, anywhere from the lynching picture of Emmett Till to the 1968 Black Power salute at the Mexico Olympics. And I showed them different images of Black people throughout history and asked them to analyze it and discuss how that represents or is a snapshot of the history of Black people. And then they were allowed to bring in their own images that support themselves and represent who they are, and then also images that represent Black people that they felt were also representative and spoke volumes through the images.
One of the things that we do is bring a visual object into class. And then based on that visual object, we're going to analyze the object and what it means to you, and then write based on that. So that's a really fun project, because what we do in Central American Studies is ask them to bring an object that relates to their identity in some way. And a lot of the times the object ends up having a lot of meaning in terms of race, in terms of ethnicity, which is all tied into their identity. So, for example, one of the things that a student brought in, which I'll show you, this is not the actual thing that she brought in, but she brought in an apron. And the apron represented for her grandmother, and so it represented her history, she said. It represented kind of the foods. It brought very familial aspects into the picture, her culture, her family, and then the way it was decorated, she felt really represented her nationality.
In my second progression in my Queer Studies Stretch course, we looked at visual representations of queer people. So we thought about the way queerness is constructed. We looked at the documentary film The Celluloid Closet to see a history of Hollywood representations of queer people. We thought about linguistic constructions of queer people. We did analysis both of visual constructions and linguistic constructions. And so to me, that's also thinking about rhetoric at the same time that we're thinking about culture representation.
Another assignment that we did was, it was a little write-up. It was like a creative writing on a picture we chose of our choice from the internet. The one I chose is of two lovers in the snow, in a snowy forest. They embrace each other cautiously because they seem to be very careful about the relationship. They don't want to be caught, it seems. This was a story I wrote from what I felt of from the picture of what I chose.
The ethnography, I had the students first understand the part of oral tradition within African life and culture, and explained how important that is for the stories to be for interviews and observations to be part of that, because there's a lot of things we haven't documented that we could have or should have or need to. So I introduced the importance of ethnography and the oral tradition and observation to the students first, and then I let them go and observe different places, and within that I actually added a piece of interviews. So they were supposed to go to this particular place, observe, and ask them 5 questions, 5 people, 5 questions. And my students said that was the one project they loved the best that semester, because it got them out of their comfort zone and forced them to have to talk to people that they would have never otherwise talked about.
What I think is really important about the ethnography exercise is that when you're talking about visual text, you want it to be based on something real. And when they do the ethnographic exercises, you know, they go out there and observe whatever it was, whatever concept it was that they originally had. Like, for example, with that exercise on this theme of community, if they were looking at some socio-political issue, they had to go out there and look for that space where they're going to be able to observe how that there's the interactions between people created this social political tension, right? So, and I think that's what's important about the ethnographic studies, is sort of basing it on something real world.
It's been a little bit difficult for me and my students sometimes to think about how to use all of these progression exercises into the culminating essay for progression 2. So what I've done in the past is I've tried a number of different things. In one case, I gave students the option. I said, either develop your ethnography into the longer essay for progression 2, or analyze the image that you talked about in the first exercise, make that analysis the longer version, or even develop the creative writing piece.
While it's probably more descriptive than argumentative, I've always just told my students that whatever it is that they write is an argumentative essay, because even if it falls within the descriptive genre, they have an argument. There's an underlying argument in everything that they write. And so you should always just think of whatever it is that you're writing as some sort of argumentative piece.
The students are going to have to, throughout the course of their academic career, definitely going to have to write argumentative essays. I mean, they're going to have to take an approach, they're going to have to pick a topic, take an approach, and argue, whether it be in a debate class, whether it be in an English class or history class, they're going to have to interpret something in some particular way. So I let the students choose their own topics and then guided them, took them to the library so that they could learn how to get sources, which was pivotal for first-year students who've never really been to the library before. So teaching them how to get sources and resources was the first step. And then, of course, guiding them through the process, having them do a paper proposal was a great way to start with that, and giving them feedback, and then having them have rough drafts and being able to peer edit those. So it was very easy to introduce it to them, especially if I let them pick a topic they liked, rather than assigning a topic to them, because then they were more passionate and they cared more about the paper.
For this, I have students watch 2 documentaries. One is Food Inc. and one is Bowling for Columbine. And what I do is I let them do what they will with it. And they have created conversations between them and their parents, talking about what food they eat, or, they've put themselves in the position of, Michael Moore and Charlton Heston from the film, and Bowling for Columbine. So they really take license with it, and I let them go free. I don't try to enforce anything other than be creative. Use this as a way of kind of understanding the material better.
I like to use argumentation because that is a skill that they're going to be using quite a bit in many of the other classes. When you're arguing for a particular position, regardless of whether it's history or sociology or psychology, we need to be able to give them that understanding that you don't just take a position, you have to be able to defend it and acknowledge that there are other views that are different from those that you have taken.
I do have formal lessons, and I've changed quite a bit in terms of the way I use research, and I've been influenced a lot by Rebecca Moore Howard and her work on the Citation Project, as well as my own experience teaching Stretch. And originally, I really wanted my students to use peer-reviewed articles that they found on their own and incorporate those articles in a sophisticated way into their own arguments. And I found that was very difficult for students to do successfully, and the results were not very good. Sometimes students were not able to understand the articles holistically, so they might take little quotes from the article that really ran against the grain of the article as a whole. And Rebecca Moore Howard calls this quote mining, where students sort of focus on little bits and pieces from the secondary sources, and then really, instead of thinking of the argument as a whole. And her research has also shown that a very high percentage of quotations from secondary sources come from the first page, which also suggests that students may not be reading the complete article. So when I found that wasn't working, what I then did is I worked with my students on secondary sources in class. So we all read secondary sources together, And then I invited my students to use those secondary sources in their papers. And at the beginning, I was reluctant to do that because I thought this doesn't encourage students to do their own independent research. But I found the results were far superior because we talked about the articles together in class. We also talked about successful ways of using outside resources following They Say, I Say, and they were able to do a much better job of using the outside resources. So it comes at a cost. You know, students were not going to the library, looking up their own secondary sources and figuring out how to use them. But I think that they were using the sources that I gave them and that we talked about together much more effectively.
Of how valuable the stretch course has been to them. And the reflective essay tends to, more or less crystallize that feeling also.
I think the informal essay or the reflective essay that we include in the portfolio is great because it gives the students a chance to just express what they think about their own writing, or maybe how they feel they've learned, what the value of their work has been, and at the same time also give feedback on the class, the writing class. And I always enjoy sort of reading, when students are more candid, when they're not afraid to say, oh, I enjoyed this professor, but I did have a hard time understanding this. Because it doesn't just help the student, but it helps me as an instructor too, on what I should be doing, right, to help the student out.
What I really like about the portfolio is, and we got this idea from visual artists' portfolios, is giving students some agency so that they have some say in how their grade is determined. That it also encourages risk-taking because what I tell my students is at the end of the semester you're going to choose some of your work to include in the portfolio. So in other words, you can leave something out if something didn't work, or if you're tired of something, you don't want to work on it anymore. So it encourages students to take risks in their writing because they know that if something fails, it's not necessarily going to count against them in their grade. So my students get the choice of leaving something out of the portfolio. I mean, artists' portfolios are supposed to be provide the artists with an opportunity to represent their best work. And so that's what I want my students to do. And I think the other thing that's important about the portfolios assignment is that the student gets to decide which is their best work. So it also helps them to think about evaluation criteria and gets them to reflect on their own work. In other words, I resist telling students, well, I think you should put this in your portfolio, but rather encouraging students to reflect on what criteria they would use and how they will decide what to put in their final portfolio.
The portfolio is very important because it's a compilation of all of the students' work over the entire semester. We focus on the preface and the reflective letter as a way to develop a metacognitive awareness of the students' writing, but also to consider the audience who will be reading these portfolios. I also have my students pick 2 of their best essays out of the whole semester, and that way they're able to showcase their work and get a grade for the class.
I tell students, whenever you're taking a course that is in the humanities or even in the arts, that the portfolio plays a really important role because it's not the same as taking a cumulative or comprehensive exam and just spitting out information. This is what I learned. You're showing how you've evolved as a writer, how you've grown. This is a representation of your best work. And when you approach it in that way, the students really understand just how important the portfolio is. And I find that they're eager to show off what they've learned, and they want the readers to see that they've developed in certain ways.